Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
In the intricate world of ethics and compliance, each second is precious, and slow case closures are more than just delays, they're missed opportunities. Enter Ethico. Our solution revolutionizes case management, cutting closure times in half and turning every challenge into a chance for improvement. Imagine a workspace where efficiency and compliance coexist harmoniously. Don't just dream of faster resolutions, make it your reality. Visit ethico.com/CPN today to book a demo and dive into our exclusive white paper by Tom Fox, the ROI of compliance, and to try our free ROI calculator. Empower your team with the tools they deserve.
10 top compliance stories for the week ending March 23, 2024. First of several stories from the Wall Street Journal, Elizabeth Warren has urged the SEC to investigate Tesla over board independence. She has raised concern about conflicts of interest and board disclosures. In a letter sent to the SEC, she asked the agency to examine whether the carmaker's board had been upfront with investors about any associated risks. She said new evidence has emerged in recent months that deepen her concern that Tesla's board lacks independence from Elon Musk, who uses his control over the board for personal benefit rather than the best interests of Tesla's shareholders. Next up from NPR, Vietnam's president has resigned after a little over a year in the position, making him the latest senior official to leave office after being implicated in a corruption scandal. The party said it had accepted his resignation and his violations left a bad mark on the reputation of the Communist Party. Next up, another story from the Wall Street Journal, this time Risk and Compliance Journal. David Smagala reporting that the Securities and Exchange Commission has fined 2 investment advisors for allegedly making statements about their use of artificial intelligence, following through on its warning to go after businesses involved in AI washing. Delphi USA and Global Predictions settled with the SEC and agreed to pay a total of $400,000 in civil penalties for their AI washing. AI washing is a term that describes businesses making unfounded AI claims to the public and has emerged as a recent target of enforcement. And one of the biggest head scratchers reported from Bloomberg that Goldman Sachs has sued Malaysia over its 1MDB settlement. Why is this a head scratcher? Well, it allows Malaysia to reopen their settlement with with Goldman Sachs. There's no way Goldman's going to win this, and it really is, like I said, a true head scratcher. And our next story comes to us once again from Bloomberg. Adani Green, the Indian company, said it has not received notice from the Department of Justice that it is under FCPA investigation. This is even though it is aware that the DOJ is investigating a third party somehow related to Adani Green. In the area of curiouser and curiouser, this is one of the most curious. Because if a supplier of yours is under investigation, I hope that you have taken a look at it and you have self-disclosed to the DOJ. But apparently, Adani Green doesn't think they need to do that. Our next story comes to us from Bloomberg, and it reports on videotapes of the Vital Traders' bribes and corruption of Ecuador. For some reason, these tapes were made. It's not clear if they were an undercover operation or a wiretap, but the persons of interest who were the subject matter of the bribery scheme were caught on tape doing what they do, which is bribery and corruption. Next up, from AML Intelligence, it reports about a woman who's found guilty of laundering Bitcoin in the UK from a $3.6 billion fraud in China. She was convicted of one count of money laundering. The prosecutor said Wen Jian helped hide the source of money allegedly stolen from 130,000 Chinese investors in fraudulent wealth schemes in the last decade. So Bitcoin continues its ignominious, role in money laundering. Next up is two stories from the Financial Times. Mike Lynch, the former head of Autonomy, has finally gone to trial in the United States on criminal matters related to the company's acquisition by HP. This has been a long story, and Mike Lynch is accused of engaging in corrupt acts which overinflated the value of Autonomy and caused damage to HP. Now, the kicker, of course, is HP recognized some of this, and even their former CFO at the time said it would be a disaster if HP did it. They went ahead and did it. They bought Autonomy for $11 billion plus. 18 months later, they had to take an $8.8 billion write-off. So, once again, it's not how much you lose, as Donald Trump has learned. If anything, it is whether you've engaged in fraud and corruption or fraud. And the evidence is pretty damning against Autonomy. So far, their former CFO, was found guilty relating to this earlier, and now Mike Lynch, having been extradited to the U.S., is facing same charges or similar charges. Next up, our second story from the Financial Times reports about property tycoon from Vietnam, Trung My Lan, who faces potential death sentence for what prosecutors say is Vietnam's biggest fraud case. Yes, even my dog is upset about this. So a huge fraud case going on in Vietnam. We earlier reported the president resigning. Well, it's unclear if he was directly related to this fraud, but multiple hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese investors lost money from this, and it turned out to be quite a devastating fraud perpetrated in Vietnam. Certainly, it speaks to the culture at the top of the Communist Party and the Vietnamese government, which allowed this type of behavior to go on in the company. And our final story comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal. And we have the double team of David Smagala and Dean Seal reporting that the Securities Futures Trading Commission, that's the CFTC, has settled with U.S. Bank and Oppenheimer over their employees' use of personal text and messaging apps that violated record-keeping rules in the latest regulatory crackdown on off-channel communication. This has been a long-going saga of these organizations, and really companies need to get with a program here on their messaging apps, because if they're a regulated industry, it's certainly going to be something that they have to. But even in non-regulated industries, the Department of Justice is beginning to talk about messaging apps and imaging of messaging apps in FCPA investigations. So this story reminds us that it's very important that you have a policy and procedure, that you enforce it and monitor it and improve it as appropriate for messaging apps. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, this month's sponsor for the entire Compliance Podcast Network is Ethico. Have you ever wondered how to show the ROI of your compliance program? Have you struggled with the budgeting process, getting the funds you want for your compliance program? Well, I've partnered with Ethico to put together a white paper on the ROI of compliance, which shows you not only how to demonstrate ROI, but also how to speak finance when you're sitting across from the CFO with your budget proposals. Check out the website, and get the white paper. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you will check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.